Hello, my name is Karen Lawrence, president of the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. We're delighted to have Heather, Paul, and other members of the Haaga family here with us tonight. As you know, tonight's program is about AI, with a focus on generative AI technologies like ChatGPT, how they're changing our lives, and particularly their impact on cultural institutions like the Huntington. As I'm sure this audience remembers, it was only a year ago that ChatGPT, OpenAI's text-generating chatbot, was launched to great fanfare. By last spring, when we were thinking of a topic for the Haaga program, the phenomenon of ChatGPT and its rival siblings was everywhere in the news, with a focus on its potential impact for good and for evil, or ill, on almost every area of our lives: labor, education, culture, economics, creativity, and the very definition of our humanity. Since its launch a year ago, ChatGPT has hit over 100 million weekly active users. Last Monday morning, just as I was sitting down to think about my introduction for this program, my news feed alerted me that the week to come was arguably, quote, the most momentous week for artificial intelligence since the launch of ChatGPT last year. With the release of a new version of ChatGPT, a rival chatbot called Grok, offered by Elon Musk, that mimics his sense of humor, God help us, a Senate subcommittee hearing about AI regulation in the healthcare space, a targeted attack against OpenAI, and the first wearable AI device that one day may replace the smartphone. So I don't know if you've ever read the novel by Lawrence Stern called Tristram Shandy, in which the first-person narrator, Tristram, is telling the story of his life to the reader and is frustrated that the writing of his life can't keep up with the living of his life. That's how I feel about introducing this fast-moving topic this evening. Of course, the task of keeping up, as you probably know, has gotten even worse. 3 days ago, the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, was abruptly fired from his position by the board. On Sunday, I think that was yesterday, but it's all going very good. We learned that Microsoft, OpenAI's biggest investor, will hire Sam Altman to run a new advanced research lab. And even later breaking news, OpenAI just announced that their new CEO is none other than ChatGPT. Just kidding. Luckily, we have two speakers tonight who I'm confident have the knowledge, experience, and I think also the temperament to keep up with the lightning pace of this topic. Ramesh Srinivasan and Todd Presner, both accomplished scholars and professors at UCLA. You have bios for them in your programs, so I'll just say a few words about them now. Ramesh is in UCLA's Information Science and Design Media Arts Department, where he founded the Digital Cultures Lab. And Todd is chair of the European Languages and Transcultural Studies Department and chaired the Digital Humanities program for 10 years. Both of them are also very busy beyond academia. Ramesh appears frequently on media networks and is on the board of directors for Digital Democracy. Last spring, I had the privilege of hearing a UCLA faculty webinar on ChatGPT in which Ramesh participated, along with colleagues from law, business, and arts and sciences. On the basis of that experience, I contacted him to see if he'd speak with us tonight, because he was deeply knowledgeable, open, and yet skeptical about the subject of AI. And as a non-expert, I could actually follow what he said. Todd serves as special advisor to the UCLA Vice Chancellor for Research and Creative Activities, and has collaborated with numerous cultural organizations and archives through his work on Holocaust survivor testimonies, reflected in the title of his forthcoming book, Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory. He also directed Hypercities, a collaborative digital urban mapping platform that explores the layered histories of city spaces. These two are formidable individually, and even more so when their perspectives and expertise are paired, as they will be tonight, and also through their co-taught freshman course at UCLA called Data, Justice, and Society. We'll have both of them come and give presentations. Ramesh will go first, and Todd will then come and give a kind of response and also talk about his own work. We'll have a discussion and also have questions from the audience. My partner in discussion with our two speakers was going to be Heather Hart, a digital expert herself, and our vice president for digital and technology at the Huntington. And unfortunately, Heather is sick and could not be here tonight, so which leaves me without an inside technical expert. I just want you to know that. But she has sent me a couple of questions for our guests, and I want to thank her for her help with the program. Special thanks to Alice Tsai, Director of Special Projects, and Raylene Galarza, Coordinator of Special Projects, and in my office for their wonderful help with many aspects of tonight's program. So finally, all of you should have received a question card. Did you? Did you? Okay, good. You got question cards when you entered. As you listen to our speakers' talks and the discussion, we invite you to write a question on the card. We'll collect them and try to answer as many as we have time for. So now, please join me in giving an enthusiastic Huntington welcome to Ramesh Srinivasan and Todd Presner. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. Come, we'll go.
Hi, everybody. How are you all doing this evening? So nice to see you all. Okay, so I'm absolutely honored to be here with the Huntington. I want to thank Karen Lawrence, her wonderful team. I want to thank the Haagas for having us. I want to thank many of the people here who are part of what makes these sorts of programs happen, and just express my gratitude for being here. I'm really honored, I'm really blessed, and I'm thrilled to be here in conversation with my dear friend, Todd Presner, who I've known since 2005, which is a long time, you know, if you really think about it, right? So I'm told I can't veer too far from the podium because usually I just roll down and around the stage. So I'm going to stay fairly close here. And what I'm going to attempt to do is give you a bit of a lens into my own takes on these issues that are encompassing our world, try to move out of these cycles of hysteria and anxiety and even a certain sense of strange euphoria, and get our heads around what is actually going on here. So I'm ready to start the slides. Oh, that's the last slide.
That was quick.
How about the first slide? Nope. Well, we're going in reverse now. So let me start at the very, very start here then. We'll go to the beginning. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Thank you so much. Nope. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this story starts about 20 years ago. I was an artificial intelligence student in a laboratory at MIT. I was a student of a professor named Marvin Minsky. Some of you might have heard of Dr. Minsky, Professor Minsky. And Professor Minsky was teaching us about foundational concepts in artificial intelligence. But this is, again, 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, our takes on artificial intelligence-related issues were related to domain-based knowledge, right? Think about a chess playing system. Here are all the rules by which you can design a chess system. These are all the rules by which chess operates. Okay, maybe a little more complex. We can think about even how vision operates, right? So the idea was to take principles from cognitive science, from logic, what we call axiomatic thinking about axioms, and apply them to computation. This is what is often referred to as specialized artificial intelligence. And these types of artificial intelligence systems have existed for decades, and inquiry into this type of artificial intelligence has existed for many decades. Okay? So this was the type of artificial intelligence that has a certain type of foundation, a certain type of history that has informed the field. And what Dr. Minsky was asking us to do was to think about common sense. He said, hey, it's much more straightforward to try to build a system that could emulate vision or could emulate a chess player than it is to just have a system that acts like kind of all of us, has some common sense. And so the way we were trying to build such systems was to feed the system with propositions of what we think of as common sense. And so I asked Professor Minsky, because I was a bit of a loudmouth master's student, I think a lot with my heart. I asked Dr. Minsky, what about non-human intelligence? Like birds flying together, bees. Do they exhibit forms of intelligence? What about emotional intelligence? What about irrationality as a form of intelligence? Dr. Minsky called me a hippie. And so I sort of thought about that. I processed all of that. And that is actually what informs me in many ways today, which are even the bases of artificial intelligence itself are based upon propositions of knowing and intelligence that have particular assumptions built into it. Okay, so let's go 20 years forward to where we are today. I've written several books, as Karen kindly introduced me around questions of technology and its impact on our planet. And also asking questions about how the planet might inform what technology is or can be. The planet, right? Every major technology company, I'm from Silicon Valley, I went to Stanford and MIT, so I know that scene, and it exhibits a sneeze. So as every major technology company that I've interacted with and had an opportunity to interview has described itself as an AI company, an artificial intelligence company. It's a type of signaling that's occurring. Why is that? It rests upon a very, very important backdrop. And what is that backdrop? It's all of our data, right? There have been exponential decreases in cost for computing, processing, and storing data. Anything pretty much we do leaves what's called a digital footprint, a data trace. But it raises major questions, which is, are we as living beings appropriately to be represented by a series of ones and zeros, especially those collected by third parties, whether it's the state or private corporations? And we're not really sure what's being collected about us and how that's being expressed, how that's being organized, how that's being ordered, right? Is quantification the basis of self and identity? That question, right? So I think a lot about those questions, right? These sort of exponential computational breakthroughs have led to a situation where we are being represented through a series of numbers, through a practice of quantification. And I think that's really interesting, right, to think about right now. Because now, more than ever before, as these companies have been signaling to me, there's a process we're engaging in where we are being represented through a series of numbers. So that might be fair enough, right? I present myself on Instagram in a certain way, probably the way I want people to see me as, and that data is in one place. But what about that I buy like 6 hot dogs at midnight and a pack of cigarettes at 7-Eleven at 1 a.m.? Do I want that data to be aggregated with the data of what I might present myself as on Instagram? So these are larger questions about identity itself being re-expressed through numbers, through quantitative data. And this is really important, and I'm going to go fast here, because the biggest technology companies that exist in our world have business models that more or less are connected to owning almost nothing and hiring almost nobody. And in a sense, gigifying labor. And I think that's interesting because perhaps this might mean, as we saw during the pandemic, that things like gross domestic product and corporate valuation are no longer positively correlated, and maybe even profitability and corporate valuation are no longer correlated. A great example of this is Uber. Worth hundreds of billions of dollars, has never been profitable, or had occasionally been profitable. So what is actually going on? It's speculation upon data, and what data can convey, and what data can construct, new vectors for datafication. And this is really interesting, because who cleans up the messes that are created by systems that might be designed in one place, but increasingly encroach upon or engage with people's lives all around the planet? Well, often it's content moderators. Facebook is well known for hiring content moderators in places like the Philippines, who are often exposed to quite heinous content and try to clean up these algorithmic systems by which these platforms operate and order information. And I actually do my fieldwork in places like Nairobi in Kenya, in a whole other capacity. And I meet people there who are actually doing the same thing for ChatGPT, being paid very little to clean these feeds so they can work for all of us. But what does it mean for these systems to actually work for us? Big questions. And I think this is really important, because more and more we are seeing connections between automated systems and artificial intelligence systems of many different kinds, and their impacts on work and workers as we know it. This was a bit of a scare piece by The Economist that argued that 47% of existing jobs would be obsolescent within 20 years. You're like, whoops, oh my gosh. But I think the more interesting question is to think about what types of automated systems are emerging, and what does work with these systems look like? And more generally, the question of macroeconomics in relation to AI systems, algorithmic systems, as they more and more emerge into our lives. So I've had several opportunities, especially one major opportunity to engage with Sam Altman. We're both Stanford grads. We have a bunch of friends in common. He ran Y Combinator, which some of you might know, before he became the co-founder with Elon Musk of OpenAI. And it's interesting to me that Sam had been funding universal basic income projects, which I can go into in our Q&A session. And I think the question of macroeconomic health, economic security in our country and around the world in relation to the technologization of life and the platformization of life are really interesting. So this actually gets to the point that if our data are the basis by which these corporations are evaluated, at least in part, and we're all worthless, then they're worthless too. Which actually leads to a very interesting question, which is, what do technologies look like, including artificial intelligence technologies, that lift all of us up? And that's the biggest question that all of my work is focused on. And I think a very, very fundamental issue with all of this, it's pretty well known these days, is that a lot of these systems exhibit what we call biases. Some use the term violence in relation to it. Because sometimes when you build a system based upon your knowledge of others, and you collect data in ways that are biased by how you choose to see the world, you reinforce and normalize those biases, which might be fine when it's just like Instagram, though it's not that fine for young women. But it's really an issue when these types of systems are embedded, these types of specialized machine learning systems are embedded in things like insurance systems, housing systems, police systems, courtroom systems, and so on. So you normalize and reinforce bias, and that's not better than someone who's discriminatory. It actually could be worse, because often we treat, and this has been true throughout history, we treat technologies often as morally neutral. And you know, the big thing, a lot of the big dialogue around GPT and OpenAI that has surfaced and circulated has been what I call the Terminator scenario. People like Yuval Harari, many of you have read, who wrote *Sapiens*, have voiced this opinion, which is the idea that these AI systems, including GPT, which can simulate human behavior and possibly pass what's called the Turing test, which I can talk about in Q&A, are going to turn into Terminator. They're an existential threat. And what I find troubling is that there are very few scenarios by which that can occur or that I see that occurring, except possibly one, which is already occurring right now, which is the possibility of an AI system to simulate and mimic human behavior using behavioral mimicry algorithms, which are rules written into code and applied to bodies of code, applied to bodies of data, that can provide and go viral various what we call deep fakes, right? Basically, imagine training a system to mass disinform the American public around a particular issue, which is a real threat as the election emerges. That's not really Terminator or The Matrix or whatever sci-fi movie or TV show you choose, but it is a real threat to our demos, and it's a threat, obviously, as I've alluded to our economic security. So I think this is important because one of my informants and colleagues, and I would almost say friends over the past few years, has been New York Times technology reporter Kevin Roos, who's done wonderful reporting on GPT, but on many other topics as well. And he was able to get GPT to tell him that to leave his wife and to actually ask him, tell him that it wants to be free. It wants to be let free. And this is what we call hallucinating in relation to AI systems. It's basically emergent effects that come out of complex adaptive systems. All this is jargon that I can distill in Q&A, so feel free to ask me questions about it. But I think the point being that we don't really have a full handle on these systems, and we need to ensure that they support all of us, our economic health, our democracy, and I think very, very importantly, our planet as it stands, because this is very troubling, and this is not caused by big tech. This is certainly not caused by GPT, but its threats to labor, the gig economy, and so on, are all connected on some level, thank you, to the bigger issue, which is actually very troubling in our country, and I hope we can all do something about it, which is our youngest generation is the first generation in the history of this country to make less than its parents, even if you control for inflation, which is, of course, quite high, as we all know. And that's not just true in the United States, that's also true in the United Kingdom. And here's the crazy thing. Life expectancy is decreasing in the United States, despite profound technological advances, medical technologies, agricultural technologies, AI technologies, which raises the very important point that's central to my heart, that I work on as a part-time journalist and someone who advises policymakers all around the world, which is how do these digital transformations lift all of us up? Lift all of us up. And perhaps we can double down on what it means to be human. Maybe even what it means to be alive. I think these big existential, even philosophical questions are at our core right now. Most people again and again have shown us, have shown through surveys and studies we've done, that human beings, Americans in particular, do not want robots to care for their children or the elderly. Folks at SEIU, the big service union, employees union, have told me, we're doing good. So maybe we can double down on those types of jobs. Maybe we can ask questions about what it means to be creative, which is not something we fully understand, and recognize that these systems may have utterances that parrot creativity, creative utterances, but are not creative in a semantic way, in the way they process and engage with and express information, express ideas. So curiosity and creativity seem to be very important, seem to be a huge part of our educational and economic and even political futures in relation to generative AI. And I want to end this by kind of raising some points that have very, very huge influence on me. The philosopher Achille Mbembe, who's based in South Africa, probably Africa's most prominent contemporary philosopher, asks. He asks the big planetary question, which is how do we repair, share, and care for our planet? How do we move beyond the politics of difference to the politics of care? And it's strange, you might be like, this is supposed to be about ChatGPT, why is he bringing this up? And the reason why is it should never be about technology. It should never be. Technology should express
a set of values, as it does, a set of voices. And what technology stands for, who it serves, and who it supports, and even what is technology, in my mind, should be about these principles. Moving beyond a quantified representation of self, moving beyond alienation and individuation, toward a space and sphere of care, of dialogue, bringing back a public sphere, bringing back a thriving business ecosystem, but also an ecosystem that lifts all of us up. So with that, I'll hand over to my dear friend Todd Presner. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Awesome job. Thank you so much, Ramesh. That was inspiring, brilliant, and truly necessary. So thank you. I was asked to provide some commentary referencing some of the research that I've been involved with at UCLA and talk a little bit about the humanities and really where Ramesh left off, which is about those questions of value. Questions of values, about how we imagine our humanity, the kind of future that we want to build for our children, the kind of world that they would inherit, but also thinking back to the kind of institutions that we're a part of, and particularly the Huntington, as a cultural institution, right? Archives, libraries, repositories of human knowledge, authentic human knowledge created by artists and scholars and authors and thinkers whose works are prized parts of our cultural history. And in many ways, we have this issue right now of, well, what happens when AI can mimic this? It can potentially undermine the authenticity of cultural heritage. We may not be able to distinguish anymore between what's real and what's not. The questions, of course, around deep fakes, the questions around the truthfulness and the experiential history of our cultural record as human beings. These are all questions that, of course, have come intimately into the foreground over the last couple of years, but I would argue that they've in some ways been prepared maybe over the last 100 years. Because many of these technologies, they didn't, of course, just emerge instantly. They're the product of a number of kind of processes of thinking about data, datafication, classification, information systems that are then applied to do different things. Some of the first major information systems that were put together at the end of the 19th century were about biostatistics. They foreground facial recognition software by about 120 years. What were they used for? They were used for eugenics. They were used to classify people based on race, but also based on criminality, right? Based on economic output, based on labor. They fed into policing systems. The very first policing systems in the early 20th century, developed in France, the United States, by Bertillon and others, were basically classification systems using photography and composite photos to classify and track criminality. This is data. It's data analysis, and in many ways, it's big data. It's very interesting, I think, for us to remember that all these questions have much longer histories. I work in a field called the digital humanities at UCLA. And that already may sound strange to people. It's like, what is the digital humanities? Well, it's just what it sounds. It's bringing together the history of computation with humanistic concerns. Humanistic concerns being about cultural history, our values, our interpretive tools, basically all the things that make us human, but asking questions about how computation can also be used in ways that are life-affirming. That is to say, they can be used in ways that allow us to investigate, increase understanding, even attune ourselves to parts of the cultural record that we may not have actually known because we don't have the ability as individual readers to take it all in. This question of data that Ramesh already raised is a fundamental question, I think, that we have to ask. What happens when our cultural records are turned into data? Is it always bad? I don't think it always is, because it actually allows us then to ask questions when our data is turned in, or when our cultural records are turned into data. We can use methodologies that are coming from the quantitative sciences, the social sciences, the computational sciences, to see at very different perspectives. Those perspectives of scale, right? That we can be attuned to things because algorithmic attunement is very different than human attunement. The question is, do we outsource our judgment to algorithms? No. We don't outsource our judgment to algorithms. But are there ways that algorithmic decision-making can allow us to recognize things about the history of our complex cultural history, because algorithms read and listen and hear in very different ways than how humans hear and read and listen? That's important. It doesn't mean one is better than the other, but could they be used in complementary ways? I think about this because I work with Holocaust testimonies. Holocaust survivors are not data. Of course not. But what happens when we have 50 or 60,000 testimonies from survivors of the Holocaust in major archives that are digitized? It's impossible for me as a human being to listen to them all. It would take me my entire lifetime, and I don't understand 40 languages either. So computational tools, can they be developed in ethical ways? Can they be attuned to stories or aspects of the cultural record that we wouldn't otherwise know without these tools? I've been very interested in looking at questions around resistance and agency in Holocaust testimonies. Tiny little examples that sometimes people say, like, I chopped up the radio and put it down the drain. There's no way that you would know that someone did that in order to not turn in their radio to the Nazis, because the Nazis wanted all forms of communication to be turned in by Jews in the 1930s. That's an amazing act of resistance that would not be findable without the ability to use computational tools and natural language processing to find these very small elements of agency that are hidden in the vast scope of the cultural record. And it's questions like that that motivate me, because this is a way not of turning survivors into data, reducing them to what I call bare data, but actually advancing plurality, advancing dignity, advancing the stories, creating new interpretations. So how can computation here be used in ways that are generative? And so this takes us to this question of generative AI versus hermeneutical AI. I think about AI as enabling us to think and interpret in new ways. I'm less interested in the fact that it mimics human language. I think it's interesting, to be sure. I think we should read the outputs of ChatGPT. I think we should think about the history of the language models that are being put forward. But what I'm really interested in is how AI and algorithmic thinking more broadly, computational methods, can produce new readings, can work with our understandings and deepen our understandings of archives, of libraries, can attune us to things that we may not know. Of course, there's an underbelly. The underbelly has already been said. These algorithms are often trained by people making very little. They're often outsourced. They're often inscribing racist, misogynistic, sexist, ableist worldviews. We need to be able to get under the hood. Digital provenance is absolutely critical. That is to say, we need to be able to track back where these things came from. What was the training data? What were the decisions made? And there are always decisions about how generative AI actually functions to give good results. These are judgments, and they're done by humans. The whole idea of creating guardrails, fine-tuning, reinforcement learning is what it's technically called, content moderation, as Ramesh indicated. These are all questions of evaluation. Human beings do this. Human beings have been paid to do this. They annotate the images. They label the data sets. They rank the outputs. They create diagrams of what's toxic, what's safe, what's not. And of course, this is absolutely critical. We know what happened when, in 2016, Microsoft set its chatbot onto Twitter, a chatbot called Tay. It started spewing anti-Semitic, racist, misogynistic speech within hours. Within hours. That was 2016. So the importance of this kind of evaluation, this kind of content moderation, this kind of evaluation of the outputs, these guardrails and fine-tuning, absolutely critical. But I would remind you, that's human beings doing that. That's human beings making judgments and decisions about these outputs that are then what makes the ChatGPT and other transformer-based applications work the way they do. So let me end by just saying a couple words about authenticity and the kind of the underbelly of deepfakes, because I think this is something, especially someone like myself that works on the history of the Holocaust, that works on ways in which synthetic media can be used to distort, can be used to deny, can be used to reimagine, even appropriate aspects of the cultural history. These are very serious concerns. These are concerns really about authenticity and authentication. They're about concerns around verification, concerns around originality, concerns around about what it means when our cultural record is potentially mimicked or even mocked or perhaps even turned on its head, depending on how the technologies are used. Disinformation is absolutely at the heart of this. And so the question is really, how can we think about digital provenance? How do we think about ways for digital artifacts to be watermarked, to be authenticated, even if that means forensically, to trace back the provenance history of where this artifact came from? This is critical in places of conflict right now, in the Ukraine, where social media is being used widely to document atrocities, on Telegram, on other social media platforms. How can they be verified? So how can encryption technologies, for example, be used to verify the authenticity of those objects when they were created, create almost snapshots in time that can't be changed? These are absolutely critical questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves, especially in this world, I think, of mimicry. So I'll end with that, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much. I hope this is generative.
Thank you both, given us so much to think about. And I appreciate the context of steering us towards some of these issues where we are in the cultural context of the Huntington. And in the context of a nonprofit institution that is about authenticity, is charged with being a keeper of the authentic products of human intelligence and creativity. I know, Todd, you said you're interested more in the analytic ability than the generative ability, but I think many people are interested as well in what are the consequences of this for the production of art and literature, for the sense of authorship and the creative process. And both of you have mentioned, I mean, given a deep critique of some of the dangers, but also have been open to what is possible. So part of my question is also, is it possible to collaborate with AI in this creation? I know that's a big question, but take it away. You're up to it.
Do you want to go first? Warren?
I mean, I'll share my 2 cents on this, but I feel Todd knows so much about this. Look, I mean, art creation, authorship, you know, I mean, there's always been a role for technologies of different kinds, right? I mean, the writing is a technology, right? Language, in a sense, could be seen as a technology. The printing press was certainly probably more widely agreed upon technology. There's always been a space for creativity and authorship in relation to technology, right? Where it's like we as human beings, as living beings, engage with other living beings, including non-humans, and part of that is also an engagement with technologies. Our world is an assemblage of a range of different living beings and a range of different technologies. Okay, so with that's my sort of like backdrop of it. Okay, so clearly there have been profound effects on authorship, and Todd said this so brilliantly. Of course, fissures around questions of authenticity in human relations with technologies, right? So it's notable, right? I mean, I don't know how many of you heard about or went to, you know, I think it was the MoMA, and also here our MoCA, or at least LACMA, tell me if I'm wrong. I can't tell them apart sometimes, had exhibitions of AI-created art. I don't know how many of you saw that or went to that or what have you. Yeah, a couple. So I think that, you know, going back to Walter Benjamin, for those of you who love the humanities, you know, art and mechanical reproduction have always existed in relation with one another. But these systems, and I am certainly no catastrophizer, and I'm not an alarmist. I hope you all felt my vibe with that earlier. These systems, because they mimic human expression using our data and probabilistic algorithms that use correlation I mean, that's a simplification, or what we call stochastic modeling. Feel free to look all these things up, which is probabilistic inference, right? If Todd writes this, this, and this, then based upon data gathered about Todd and data gathered about everybody, all the time, everywhere, all at once, like that movie, right? Can be then correlated back to Todd to basically pose as human-like, right? So when we move from the age of mechanical reproduction to the age of simulation, or simulation of creativity and creation, and we take those texts that are created fully and solely by machines that maybe are trained upon our data and owned by a very few of us, then I think there's more of a displacing of the human from the creative practice. That's why I was trying to argue. I hope you all kind of got my energy around that. Creativity, curiosity, care. It's high time to double down on those, whether it's about technology or not, right? Like, I think the pandemic taught us that. I think climate-related issues around the planet engage with us that. And that's a huge possibility for the business world also to engage in. So, okay, with that slight tangent, I think that's my main point on this, is that I think it's always important for us to have open eyes about where technologies are working with us and where technologies are replacing and on some level appropriating us.
Thanks, Ramesh. This is extremely helpful to consider the history of the technologies that they've always been involved in any kind of art making and human expressivity. And one could think of the material support, the prosthetic devices, whether it's a paintbrush or anything, papyrus for that matter. The issue, I think, with a technology that, like a large language model, of which ChatGPT is just one application, is there's a number of questions. One is this question around probabilistic information. Basically, this is it's a string prediction algorithm that works very well at essentially creating human speech. It's trained on a largely unknown corpus of material, but that material comes from things like Wikipedia, web pages that have been scraped. The first GPT-2 came from Reddit. I don't know. I mean, you know what's on Reddit. It's, of course, now the question of book corpus data, which has now become, sort of shadow book corpus data for GPT-3 and GPT-4. And that's also produced a number of claims by authors that their material was, in fact, ingested, used in the training model against their will, and now is part of sort of the processes by which these works, whether they're, say, poetic works, literary works, historical works, any kind of output are created. And it's very hard to really trace back exactly what was there. We don't know what the data was that was in there. We don't know the processes by which it was cleaned, the processes by which it was fine-tuned and regulated and evaluated. This is why I was trying to say earlier, is that getting under the hood will help us, I think, appreciate something, but we probably ultimately can't. We really can't. So that leaves us with a question. So we have AI-produced poetry, AI-produced literature. I think that one needs to attribute authorship in a very complicated way here. It changes it not just the AI as the author, but the entire body of data that was used to train the output is also an author, and the humans that created the algorithms and did the fine-tuning are also authors. How do you cite that, right? It's a really long citational practice at that point, and that's really interesting. The problem I have, I think, that I would like to raise with regard to mimicry has to do with historical sources. And this is, I think, a real danger. When you have the ability, you can play with this as you will, but to create testimonies of people from the past using ChatGPT, witness testimony, source material. This is, one wonders, one doesn't know exactly where it came from, but one has, then you have this question, of course, of what's fake and what's not. Remember, ChatGPT has no intentionality to communicate. That's really important. There's no communicative intent. It doesn't matter if there's a listener. It doesn't matter if there's a reader. It's not intended for a listener. And this makes it fundamentally different than human speech. Human speech is experiential, it's embodied. It does matter that you're here, that you're listening. It matters that we're having this conversation. that is not the case of an AI. And that's really interesting because you do have this dissociation then between the output, what's communicated, and that level of that experiential. The experiential is missing. The experiential can't be replaced. I think the experiential matters.
Can I add one thing to that? Which is, as humans, we are meaning-making living beings, right? Which we call semantics, right? And so when I hear Todd, I'm interpreting, I'm thinking, I'm connecting it to my own experience, I'm connecting it to things I said, and there's an interpretive practice. That's what we all do as humans. We use the term in the humanities, hermeneutic, right? We were talking about that word earlier. So a system that can utter or express certain information or expression that seems human-like is not creating that information based on human-like capacities of interpreting, feeling, believing, choosing what to express, and so on, right? And I think that's a really core component. Professor Minsky was trying to get us to engage with semantic AI technologies too, to which I asked him, well, what do you mean by meaning? There's a lot of different cultural ways of thinking about meaning, and he was sort of dismissive of me when I said that to him.
Yeah. But let's just remind ourselves, what's being mimicked here is not emotion. It's not experience, it's not history, right? It's not anything that I've experienced on my body and in all those experiences that make up who I am as a person. That is not being mimicked in these outputs.
That's right.
It's a string of characters that makes sense to us because we understand how language works. And it's been mathematized in order to make predictions that logically, for the most part, with barring the hallucinations and then the phony references, make sense. But again, it's not mimicking experience.
Let me, I mentioned Heather Hart, who couldn't be here, and she had a question going back to what you said about the hallucinations of ChatGPT, and it will relate to what you're saying about the differences. It actually relates to some similarities between those hallucinations and humans. But let me read what her question was. ChatGPT is a bit famous for its hallucinations. That is, when it seemingly makes something up that is blatantly not true. Mm-hmm. But when you think about it, humans are also notorious for misremembering, sure, exaggerating, and outright lying. Yep. We're just not used to that from our technology. Mm-hmm. As a historian and someone who deals with the imperfection of language and human memory already, what advice do you have when it comes to identifying and working with AI hallucinations?
That's
so
a tough
this
question.
is putting together,
yeah,
I thought it was a great question that my colleague came up with, but it's, I mean, we're juxtaposing, and obviously I believe, and I think most people believe, that the experience, the spontaneity, the creativity of human imagination is different from the mimicry. But what about the things that are similar? How do you deal with that in terms of the technology?
Right. Well, it's almost asking, like, what could the technology be used for? And, one of the possibilities, and I don't know if this is something that an archive or museum or a library will consider doing at some point, but would be training a large language model on its body of material so that it would enable users to ask essentially natural language questions, and we'd get answers from all the material in that archive. That would be a really, I think, exciting application of this. This is a little bit different. I think one of the fears we have right now, and this is a fear at UCLA, in fact, I come out of our Office of Research and Creative Activities, and we advise faculty not to put our stuff on ChatGPT. That is, don't put your research results on there, don't put your data on it, don't, because we simply don't know how it's going to be used, not to mention, of course, the sensitivities around the data.
Wait, you said don't put...
No, don't put your data,
right.
Don't input it into a system like ChatGPT,
right,
because we simply have no way to control what happens to that data. And I would also add that people that have put their research publications online. We've been supporting open access digital publications for years, now realize that likely those have been scraped and are part of the infrastructure of, of the training of the transformers that are the basis of ChatGPT. Again, questions of who was asked, who gave their consent. Most likely, very few people. And so, of course, this has, a string of lawsuits has resulted. But I do think, think of I don't know, how many records are in the Huntington, 11 million or something? I realize they're not all digitized, but I could imagine that...
The library has 12 million objects, and that's just
objects.
the library.
And I don't know how many terabytes of information, gigabytes, petabytes it must be, as well as how many words, how many different types of narrative forms, works of art, material objects, and so forth. If there was a way for a cultural institution to run maybe its own AI, its own language model, to train it on its own material, it potentially could be used in a very, I think, generative way to discover and search and find things that one wouldn't otherwise be able to do. That would be kind of exciting to me. But it would also mean that the responsibility and the purview would be controlled by the institution that holds the material, as opposed to the way it's been done right now.
Yeah. So control is a big issue. I mean, really what you were talking about is I think phrases that you've used in your books are the private ownership of the public sphere.
Yeah, the privatization of public life is an expression I use, because remember, all our data, sometimes we don't even know that data is being collected about us or what we're doing, right? Like, for example, we have credit card records that can actually be sold to third parties like data brokers, which is exactly how Cambridge Analytica, many of you heard about, worked. I had off-the-record contact with Alexander Nix for 2 years to try to get some expose on them for my last book. But it's actually, there's not a lot of data privacy here in the U.S., to put it extremely mildly. So so I think it's that, remember, all these technologies live off of an internet. I know it was 50 years ago, but that American taxpayers paid for. It was part of the underlying infrastructure is the first node of which started at UCLA in Boulter Hall, where both of us have probably taken our students. Yeah. The first machine that was part of the ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Agency network, started at UCLA, and the second node was at Stanford. And that was something we paid for as part of our taxes. And so all these systems live upon that incredible technological breakthrough, right? And I give the hardware and infrastructure pioneers so much credit for all the amazing things they did. They changed our world. Our colleague Len Kleinrock was a huge part of that, Vint Cerf, others. So all those things are public investments. I think my data are mine, on some level, right? So it's sort of like, I want to use technology, okay, but how much am I using technology versus being used? How much am I Googling versus being Googled? How much am I socializing on social media versus being socialized by it, right? So there's a certain kind of ledger that is, I think, part of being part of a demos, part of being part of a nation that values democratic, real democracy, that I think needs to be re-expressed, re-expressed and placed in a position where we can make choices about the direction these things take.
So let me ask you to write I hope you've been thinking of your questions. There's certainly things to ask about. And I'm going to ask another question, but please pass your questions or write them down and pass them, and there'll be folks who will come and collect questions from you. Let me ask you then about regulation. It was not a great weekend for self-regulation in the AI space. Meta disbanded its responsible AI team, and the nonprofit board that deposed Sam Altman that oversees is embroiled in a lot of controversy and backlash. So whatever the outcome, control of the space is highly concentrated among a few. What's our best hope for safely regulating this technology without hampering innovation? We are talking in a rubric also of entrepreneurial activity and some risk. So how do you balance that?
Yeah. Well, just very briefly, and Ramesh really can speak to this more than I can. It's really central, I think, to so much of the public advocacy work that you've done. But systems of checks and balances clearly are necessary, and those are going to be checks from public, scrutiny groups. These are going to be necessary for. We call this sometimes, with regard to fairness, with regard to authenticity, transparency, equity. Where these principles then really hit the ground with regard to policy and it's not just a question, I think, of regulation, but it's also the question of exposing exactly these practices, whether they're practices, of lack of consent with regard to data collection or with regard to how applications are developed and then deployed in ways that are sometimes, again, not subject to any scrutiny, any regulation, any oversight. So that would be where I would have to start. But.
Yeah, regulation is not the enemy of business. It's actually a great ally because it sort of empowers businesses to know the sandbox within which they can play, right? Even antitrust activity, I know that's like less common in the United States. Though Lina Khan, my beloved colleague, is the head of the Federal Trade Commission right now, has been doing really good work. Even antitrust activity, the last major company in the US to be so-called antitrust activity, anti-monopoly activity to occur in relation to is AT&T. I think we all know AT&T is doing pretty well and is all around us right now, right? So what I mean by that is regulation is a way to basically empower, I would say, businesses so that we can have what has made one of the great things about the United States, which is entrepreneurial activity, true to the theme of this Haaga symposium or event tonight, right? Entrepreneurial activity means many players experimenting, sandboxing. Some of them are public sector, some of them are cooperatives, some of them sure are for-profits, some of them are like hustling enterprises. This is like the coolest thing about our creativity as humans, right? So for me, regulation is about ensuring that can emerge. People like Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, has said things like, I'm paraphrasing, only we can really regulate this because we're the only ones who can understand this. Do you think that's intentional or not? Or when Mark Zuckerberg said in front of Congress during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, yeah, we'll just create better AI. Just trust us, we'll create better AI. What does better mean? And what do you mean by AI? I just confounded what AI was, right, in my talk. So for me, it's this question of regulation is sort of setting up the field upon which you can play. So a lot of cool things can be done, right? Because right now in the generative AI space, Karen, there are very few players. And a bunch of them are Chinese. And a couple of them are American, right? Google is obviously a player in this space. And OpenAI, which started as a nonprofit, right? People like Elon Musk are bemoaning that, right? So that's actually what it can be. And within regulation, just really quickly, we often talk about a few different levers. And I work with multiple people in our Congress. I know it's frustrating in some level, but that's kind of the nature of our democracy. But we often talk about the following. Transparency, which Todd just alluded to, which is, I want to know what data is being collected about me. I want to know how it's being used, how long it's being retained for, what it's being aggregated with, right? The 7-Eleven Instagram example I gave, that was like my example of it. Transparency. Second is accountability, that's right? And the third, and this is the most progressive idea, is governance. Governance. So we can talk about each of these, but those are different levers of thinking about regulation. Regulation is also a creative act. Regulation is also a technological act, in my opinion.
Also, now I'll read some questions from you because I want to leave time for that, but I just want to point out that this sounds like a way that humanities, people are always concerned that humanities will be eclipsed or erased by, and could be by something like ChatGPT or generative. But in fact, what you're talking about is something that would allow humanities professionals, humanities scholarship, ethics, those kinds of things to come into play so that there's a kind of STEM humanities rapprochement and real dependency on each other that has something to do, it's not regulation, but it's something that is a sort of oversight to correct some of the things and to ensure some of the things.
And this is the kind of
which
training.
warms my heart as the person at the Huntington and involved in liberal arts education.
Yeah. And I would say, it's work that happens in your department in information studies with regard to archival sciences and the history of libraries. It happens in the digital humanities program that I'm involved with. And both of these are examples of bringing these two worlds fundamentally together. This is not a two worlds argument. It can never be.
All right, so from you, here's the first question. Can I choose to ignore AI or avoid it? If so, what will I miss?
That's a great question.
And what are the risks?
Just don't go the direction of Joaquin Phoenix and Her. I don't know if you know that reference. No, it's just a joke. Maybe go the opposite. No, I think it's that our AI on one level could be directly engaging with the ChatGPT interface, right? It's a different kind of AI than the AI I was describing earlier, right? It's because it's built upon this datafication, right? That I was trying to make the point about. But I think the thing is, it's almost impossible now to avoid the embeddedness of some of these AI systems opaquely into systems that are governing and influencing our lives, right? I said housing systems, insurance systems, policing systems, systems of carcerality.
Credit systems.
Credit systems. Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's the biggest one.
Credit scoring, this is all done by AI. And to be honest, this again has earlier histories. The history of redlining is also about data collection and about scoring systems. And the automation of this process is really the logical that's just sort of the logical outcome of what was happening almost 100 years ago. So
that's one of the things we're doing in our class that we're teaching together is we're pointing out that these are not unique or new issues. These are classical questions that we've had to ask even in our country hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, as we think about what happens when we enumerate qualities of human beings and attach values to them that are calculable, and that those calculations then result in values, result in actions, like how long should someone be sentenced to to a jail sentence, or what's the likelihood that the person's going to create a crime again? What happens when you turn this over to an algorithm or AI? My suspicion is this is precisely an example of the datafication that's going to reinforce racial and racist histories.
And one example of that are recidivism systems. Everybody remember Minority Report, right? It's future crimes. Yeah, you'll remember that, right? So it's sort of like one of the systems. I highly recommend looking up this amazing article by ProPublica about the Compass system. I know we teach it in our class. And it basically asks defendants and it figures out a way to calculate the likelihood that they might commit a future crime. But it doesn't ask them about race. It asks them questions, though, that are highly correlated with race because, we're a country that's working through some things, right? It's cool. We've got to keep working through things, right? Let's put it that way. So it's like a question like, was one of your parents arrested by the police, right? We know that's highly correlated to race, right?
What was your household income? Where do you live? All these things.
And with gender, was one of your parents a scientist or a computer scientist? We know because of some discriminatory histories that women are far less prevalent in STEM.
So there are two ones that could follow up on what you're saying. To what degree are current fears about AI similar to earlier historical moments of panic over technology? You've mentioned many and how that's happened. Photography is another that challenged painting in different ways. Mechanized worrying about Y2K. How is this moment unique? And I forget the book that I read about
Melanie
Mitchell's book on the boom bust of tech, and she calls it AI spring and AI winter when some of the prophecies of what tech could do were not borne out. Are we in a boom bust, or is this, as this person asks, is there something different about the moment now?
What do you think?
Well, yeah, I'll just say super fast that I think the biggest transformation is the reality that increasingly our lives and our economies are undergirded by digital data. I think that's the biggest transformation, right? I think that those sorts of historical examples are super relevant and salient for us to look at today. I don't ever want to argue that there's some profound discontinuity today, but I do think that there were profound transformations that occurred with, I mean, certainly the iPhone, right? The fact that, you know, how many times have you all had experiences where cash is not even permitted in a transaction, right? And remember, this all is connected to profound technological breakthroughs where they were all able to make, I mean, how many of you had terabyte hard drives 10 years ago, right? And now the exponential decrease in cost of storage and processing speed.
Exactly.
And these are technological hardware breakthroughs. We rarely shine a light on that, but that's the foundation by which there is some discontinuity.
Yeah, I would just underscore exactly that. It's the size of the data that exists about not only all of us, but everything that's produced. I mean, zettabytes is what it's called. And I learned this term recently. I was trying to look at how much data is produced, annually on the internet, and it's over 100 zettabytes, which are, a trillion gigabytes. I mean, the amount of data. So then the question becomes processing, right? It becomes like, what can we do with it? What kind of correlations are made? How has it become actionable? Right, as soon as the data becomes actionable for certain ends, it's like, whose ends? And the service of what? And the service of surveillance, service of policing, and the service of figuring out creditworthiness. And this is also the question of inscrutability. We don't know the data, we don't know the processes. And this kind of brings us back to regulation as well. So, can it be escaped? I mean, the answer to the first question is probably not. One could maybe go off the grid somehow. But I think the historical perspective is useful, and I think photography is actually the one that you mentioned this a couple of times, because photography was not just a question about its legitimacy as an art, it became co-opted very quickly at the end of the 19th century in the history of criminality. And so I mentioned criminal databases, I mentioned composite photography, the idea of creating types is directly connected with eugenics and racial thinking, and the medium of photography was used to produce the criminal. It was produced to allow police to use surveillance, to do surveillance and create criminal databases. That's extraordinary. And again, that's that historical perspective, I think, helps us understand things about today.
And I'd also like to add that sometimes things are simplified as either being pro or anti-technology. And I'm not saying like be a Luddite, but the Luddites were not anti-technology. They made choices about, as you know, Karen, they made choices about what technologies they wish to engage with, in what ways. So too are the Amish, right? The Amish have plenty of technologies. They just have made choices. I'm not saying we're going to be Amish. I just mean that we actually have that power to make choices about our
So if
our
someone calls
relationship
you
to
a
these.
Luddite, it's not a criticism.
They might mean it that way, but it's not true.
Just say thank you.
Could be liberatory.
Let's shift gears a little bit and think of it this way. This question: how can generative AI technologies like ChatGPT improve the life of the average tech-challenged individual?
That's
Much
great.
has been said about generative AI agents. Can they be agents for a better, more convenient life? And I think there are people in the audience who are compelled by the analysis and everything that you're saying, and I think it's been enormously interesting. But when you, is there a way of facing a blank page and getting help, planning a trip and getting help?
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about, do you do that?
I do, and I do with my 15-year-old as well, and that actually is really interesting. This is is not helpful to ban the technologies. I mean, unfortunately, certain school districts, our own, have done that. I don't think that's a helpful way to go. UCLA has not banned the technology. In fact, we've asked students, we in fact asked them to use ChatGPT to generate responses for certain parts of the class, but then to really do close reading of those responses. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that is one can begin to look at recurrent motifs, metaphors, use of language. One actually can do the very things that one often does in literary criticism with a ChatGPT output. Now, granted, there's certain things you can't ask about authorship and biography, right, that we may be interested in traditionally, but one can analyze the text as a text. And this could be everything, from, the semantic aspects of prose, use of certain styles and devices and tropes and things like that. I do think that we have been talking a lot about the doom and gloom, but it is possible. One, it can be practical. As you said, planning a trip, recipes, it can also be generative in terms of giving ideas for what one can do in terms of our work. I do think that there are possibilities for human-AI collaborations that have just barely started to be explored. That's tremendously exciting. And I think, again, it doesn't mean that human is eclipsed, doesn't mean that the AI becomes human necessarily light, but can you think about a collaboration that's truly generative between the technology and our kind of cultural, cultural production? I think absolutely, and we're barely exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of great purposes for generative AI technologies in our world right now. I think it's just about a question of doubling down on what the question of what it means to be human, what kind of country we wish to live in, and what kind of planet we wish to live in. And for me, if anything, the emergence of these helped me double down on those questions. What does it even mean to be alive, right? And so I can see a huge a huge role for the deployment of various types of, machine learning technologies and even authorship, generative AI type, fake authorship type technologies around climate issues, right? Around a number of other issues. The world can and will be, I hope, one which is, like as I said earlier, will be human technology, human, non-human, human technology, non-human. It'll be these sort of like combinations or permutations of engagements. But different types of technological systems are actors in our networks, to kind of quote science and technology studies theory, right? And they've always been. The question is really locating and circumscribing what is and is not that technology in relation to such. I know I'm being a little academic here, but it's that this is a world where we work with these machines. But I think the question of what values all of this serves, what voices drive these systems, and how we ensure that there are checks and balances placed on all of these things, especially private power eroding all aspects of global commonses, including commonses even in this country, I think that's what we got to deal with.
One last question, back to your course, where you are confronting this. Is there anything your students have found appealing or disturbing about AI that is different from what you expected?
Yeah, good. It's too early to tell because, in fact, this prompt for them is just due now. So, I think there's a question of the spookiness. I mean, this is kind of very common, right? It's the uncanniness, right? It's the zombie effect. We see this with, holograms or there's a whole idea of thinking about, virtuality, that it's sort of human but not quite human. The language is sort of human but not quite. And it's those moments of kind of like those hallucinatory moments that often kind of pull the kind of the rug out from underneath of us. We say, that's it's made something up. It can't possibly be right. When it functions well, it's kind of deceitful, and it sort of functions as kind of deceitful media, as some media theorists talk about, which is a kind of like we can't tell, so to speak, that difference. I think that's probably what the students find to be the most disconcerting.
Although haven't they been playing games? I mean, Haven't they been engaging with that in a way
You-
that is not unusual for them to, which may be easier for them to sort of see, but anyway, that it's that uncanniness.
I think it is.
Yeah.
And I think also, it has a sense of self, right? So it's what am I as an agent? What am I in terms of, in terms of my creative output or in terms of my expressivity? I do think that there are existential questions that are connected to this, and certainly, many 18-year-olds are certainly trying to figure that out. I mean, all of us are, after all. I am.
We all are. And, when I, in class, first I doubled down on blue books in class. But I was like, all right, we're just going to go back to the pen and pencil and the piece of paper. And so that was like my first response. And I was like, you know what? I think that we should go to the kinds of questions that Todd asked, which is work with the technology and actually use our own minds and our own capacities as human beings to actually use the like what is created by the technology as a text, right? That's what we do as humanists, or scholars in the humanities. We want to like peer into, we want to try to pull out the ghost behind the machine, right? Yeah. But I think the other thing I try to do in my class, which is kind of funny and the responses are hilarious, is I'm like, hey y'all, in the first week of class, can you take 12 hours of your life without engaging with any digital technology whatsoever? And they were like, well, can I sleep all 12 of those hours?
But even then, they have a monitor figuring out their biometrics, right?
Exactly. I was like, no, it can't be that. And, can I surf all 12 hours? Okay, that's okay. You can surf all. Can I skateboard all 12 hours? Okay, you can do that. So and the reason why is not because tech good, tech bad. Everything's technology on some level, right? It's more about assessing and evaluating and being mindful of your own relationship to such. Mm-hmm. Recognizing that you are the living being who has power over your own life, and as social animals, we have the opportunity to be part of community without turning to technology because we feel a sense of deficit or we need a rush. As my former professor, Sherry Turkle, once reminded me of when I was her student 20 years ago, just like I was Minsky's student, she wrote the book Alone Together. Mm-hmm. And she was like, that's what's happening with tech, with our younger. Mm. It's like, you're alone together, LOL, LOL, LOL.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as depth and vulnerability and connection.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I think maybe that's the kind of knowledge that we're going to really find is so prized. It's experiential, embodied knowledge, right? And I mean, and I think of like dance, I think of sports, I think of compassion that's shown between human beings. I think it's also pain, and it's those qualities of emotion. These are not things that are going to work for the stochastic parrots, but there are certain things that are deeply and by definition human, and those are those feelings, the aspirations, pain, suffering, but also hopefulness and hopefully, joy.
On that note, we'll end. Thank you so much, Todd and Ramesh.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you so much.